Caroline Leavitt, the White House secretary, sat in her office and looked at a photograph of her childhood. It was a photo of her school years. She, in her old school dress, with a smile on her face, stood next to the familiar walls of her school. All these years, despite her huge career and busy schedule, she could not forget her small homeland, her first school, where she was inspired by teachers and where she first felt a taste for knowledge. The walls of that school were for her a symbol of the time when everything seemed possible and unlimited. One day, sitting at her desk, Caroline realized she needed to go back there. Perhaps it was a need for something familiar and simple. She thought about how many years had passed since she left her homeland to pursue a career in politics. She decided it was time to go back there, to return for a moment to the world where her life began, where there were dreams unburdened by worries. The next morning, she got in her car and drove to her hometown, which was a few hours outside of Washington. On the way, she remembered how she always rushed to class with her friends, how she ran around the schoolyard, and how she experienced every event, be it a school play or participation in a competition. All of this now seemed so distant, almost forgotten, but she clearly remembered how school was everything to her. It was a place where she felt valued and supported. It was at this school that she first realized that she could achieve great things. When Caroline arrived in town, her heart sank with nostalgia. Everything was so familiar, yet so different. The streets she once walked through every day now seemed much narrower and quieter. Some of the houses had been renovated, but much remained the same. She drove past the old park where she had once played hide-and-seek with her friends, and noticed how much everything had changed, but at the same time how much had remained in the past. As she approached the schoolyard, Caroline felt a strange excitement. This was the place where she had spent so many hours. She peered at the old school building, the windows no longer as bright as she remembered. The outside of the school was the same, but there were many changes around it. There was a new playground, and new benches had appeared on the old trees under which she had once sat and talked with her friends. Caroline stood at the gate, a little unsure of what to do next. She had never imagined that she would return here in this role, as a White House secretary, a person who had become an important political figure, but now, as she stood at these gates, she felt that she had an opportunity to recapture at least a part of her old life, her first dreams. At that moment, the old school janitor approached her. He was a short man with a kind face, but slightly hunched over with age. He looked about 80 years old, but his eyes were burning with some kind of inner fire. He extended his hand and smiled. "Hello, madam, can I help you with something?" he asked in a warm accent that Caroline recognized easily. It was Joe, the old janitor she remembered from her time at school here. Caroline couldn't believe her eyes at first. She remembered how he always smiled. Despite the difficulties of his job, he was constant in his role at the school, seemingly invisible to most people, but it was his presence that made the atmosphere of the school so welcoming. "Joe, is that you?" she asked, looking at him in amazement. "Yeah, I'm real," he replied, smiling. "And you, Caroline, have become quite grown up." Caroline froze for a moment. This old janitor, who had seen her learn and grow, had been here all these years, keeping the school in order, and despite all the changes around him, he was still the same person who had once been a part of her life. It surprised her. How could a person stay in the same place for so long, without changing, remaining true to his work? "Are you still working here?" she asked in surprise. "Well, yeah," Joe said, squinting into the sun, "since about 1960, so, you know. This whole school is like home to me. I see how things change, how the kids grow up, but I'm still here, and I see you've gone far away." Caroline felt a wave of respect for this man. She had always known Joe was special, but now, looking at him from afar, she realized that he was a symbol of the importance of being committed to your work and the place that had become your home. He was not a politician, nor was he a famous scientist, but his work was important and he remained true to his principles, despite the years. "I want to walk around the school," she said. "Would you like to join me?" "Of course, madam," said Joe, nodding and smiling. And together they walked towards the schoolyard where it all began for Caroline. Caroline and Joe walked slowly across the schoolyard. It was just as she remembered it, only now, instead of the usual noise of children's voices and bells, there was silence. The school day was long over, and almost all the students had gone home. However, for Caroline, the empty yard was filled with memories. She looked around, and every corner reminded her of her childhood, of a time when everything was so simple. "You're probably surprised I'm still here," Joe said, breaking the silence. It was as if he'd read her mind. Caroline smiled slightly, although inside she was worried about how life worked out for people who stayed in one place, who didn't change over the years. As soon as she heard his voice, she knew that this school was more than just a place of work for Joe. He felt its pulse, knew its smells, its sounds, and perhaps couldn't even imagine life without this school. "Not exactly," she replied, trying to hide her feelings, "but I didn't think you'd been working here all these years." "Well, who else is going to keep it clean?" Joe laughed. His voice was full of life, as if the years hadn't touched him. "And working at a school isn't just about cleaning. It's about taking care of a house. I've always believed that if you work at a place like this, you have to invest in the people. We cleaners are kind of like caretakers, after all." Caroline stopped, looked at Joe carefully, and then asked slowly, "What has changed over all these years? You have seen so many generations. How have you survived all this?" Joe thought about it. He looked at the school building, as if he was remembering every corner, every wall, every break. "You know, I've seen generations come and go. It was hard in the beginning because I wasn't a scientist, I wasn't a teacher, but I knew I could do important work. I know who came to this school, which kids came with difficulties and which ones with sparkling eyes. I've seen them grow up and become something more. Sometimes even teachers were surprised how I could know so much about school children." Caroline felt a deep respect for this man enter her heart. Joe wasn't just a janitor, he was part of this school. He had seen children grow up, one era end and another begin. He had witnessed all those processes that those who came here for a few years and left did not even suspect. "You have some kind of connection with every student, right?" she asked, her voice full of wonder and respect. "Yes," Joe answered, shaking his head with a smile. "Some people think that we cleaners are invisible, that we just do our job and that's it, but we see more than we seem. I can remember you coming here, the other kids coming, and each one of them was unique, like a little miracle. I remember you, Caroline, always sitting in the front row in class and participating actively. You were different, you were ready to take responsibility, even when you were very young." Caroline felt her heart clench. It was nice to hear those words, especially from someone who seemed to have little influence in the school, but his observations were so accurate that she began to take them in with new power. He was not just a janitor, but an observer who saw things that were hidden from the eyes of most. "I'm glad you remember," she said, smiling. "Of course I remember. You were one of those people who always wanted to do something more. I saw how you were burning with ideas. It was nice to see. Sometimes we old people think that everything becomes more difficult with age, but you, Caroline, showed how important it is to follow your dreams, even if the road is difficult." As they continued to walk around the schoolyard, Caroline became more and more aware of how little she knew about the people who had once been around her but had gone unnoticed, how much was behind the scenes, hidden from the eyes of students and teachers. Joe spoke of his observations of life, and his words carried a wisdom that was not immediately apparent. He spoke of people who asked for nothing in return, of those who did their job day after day, remaining in the shadows. "You were almost always here, weren't you?" Caroline asked. Yes, Joe replied. Time flies. I've become a part of this school. At first I just cleaned the classrooms, then I took on additional responsibilities. But the most important thing is the connection with the kids. I always knew they needed to know that they weren't just learning lessons, they were learning about life. You're right, it's important. You're part of this school, part of its history, Caroline said, realizing how invaluable each person's role in the life of this place was. Joe smiled, but there was something special in his eyes, a deep understanding that sometimes the most important work is done in the shadows, and it was people like him who made the world a better place despite their invisibility. They were important not because of what they did, but because of how it helped others. As they walked through the school corridors, Caroline couldn't help but think about how important every moment, every person in our lives is. Sometimes it's the ones we don't notice who are the ones who give our lives meaning. Soon they came to the great hall where school events had once been held. Inside, everything was the same as before, only now it looked a little emptier and foggier, filled with the shadow of years long gone. There have always been a lot of children here, Joe said, looking at the empty chairs. Sometimes I think the walls of this room remember all that laughter and joy. Caroline looked at him and nodded. She, too, felt the history of this school alive in every corner, in every brick. Thanks for sharing all this, Joe. You've opened up a lot to me. Joe just smiled, his eyes sparkling. All life is like a school, Caroline. We are all learning here, even if we don't realize it. Gradually, evening began to fall on the school, and shadows stretched across the old walls, creating an atmosphere of silence and calm. Caroline and Joe continued their way through the school. Joe was more and more lost in memories, and every step he took, every glance he cast at familiar places seemed to open up a whole world to him. This was the school that had become his home, and for him everything was connected to this building. He was a part of its history, and now, after all these years, he shared with Caroline what he had seen. Do you remember how I always cleaned these stairs? He asked, pointing to the old wooden stairs that led up to the auditorium. I always thought this area was important. Everyone who walked up or down had to feel that it was clean, and it was like more than just a job. It was like an important reminder that there was an order to life. This place wasn't supposed to be squalid. Caroline paused and looked at the stairs. She always passed them by without noticing them, but now, after Joe's words, it seemed to her that the stairs were a symbol of something much larger. They were a corner of the care and attention that Joe had put into his work. I never thought of it that way, she admitted. To me, it was always just a place we all walked, but now I realize it's something important. Yes, Joe answered, nodding. Many things seem mundane, but if you put a part of yourself into them, they become something much more meaningful. I have always tried to take care of every corner of this school. After all, every corner is not just a part of the building, but a place where important moments of life take place. As they continued on their way, Caroline felt her own memories begin to return. All these years she had neglected the simple things, but now, meeting Joe and hearing his thoughts, she began to think about how important the little things and everyday actions were. They walked out into the schoolyard where she and her friends had once played football, ridden bikes, and had picnics. It was still light outside, despite the late hour, and Caroline felt vivid images emerge from her memories. When I was here, I often thought that I was destined to be something great, she began. I was sure that everything would be easy. I remember how my friends and I made big plans for the future, and how it seemed to me that all these walls, all these teachers were so small compared to what I could achieve. Joe listened attentively, his face serious, but his eyes warm, as if he were a very close friend who was ready to listen and understand. You know, sometimes people who seem small or insignificant can be much more important than they seem at first glance, he said, smiling a little. For example, you grew up and did a lot of great things, but someone was still there to support you, to help you every step of the way. Sometimes the little things add up to a big picture, and then you begin to understand how important it all was. Caroline paused. His words had struck a chord with her. She remembered her high school math teacher, a strict but kind woman who had always believed in her, even when she doubted herself. She remembered that old history teacher who had taught her that it was important not only to learn, but to understand how your life fits into the context of history. All of these people, despite their ordinariness, were becoming important parts of her journey. "You're right, Joe," Caroline said, turning to him. "All these years, I've forgotten how important those little moments are, those simple things that people do without saying anything. We're all always striving for something big, for something global, and sometimes we forget that it's the little things that make up everything great." "Yes, sometimes the greatest things begin with the smallest steps," Joe agreed. "You have achieved a lot, Caroline, but perhaps it is important to remember that your journey began here, within these walls, and every moment, every encounter, even with people like me, matters too." Caroline felt his words penetrate her soul. He spoke so simply, so sincerely, but there was a deep wisdom in his words. At some point, she realized that she had been too focused on her achievements and not paying enough attention to the moments that really mattered. She remembered how, when she was younger, she had thought that her career and success were what defined her life, but now, looking back on her past, she realized that it was the small but meaningful moments that really mattered. "Thank you, Joe," she said, and there was genuine gratitude in her voice. "You've opened my eyes to a lot of things I didn't notice. I think I've spent too much time chasing my dreams, forgetting that it's not just where you go, but what you leave behind." "You're welcome," Joe replied with a smile. "You figured it out yourself. Life isn't just about what we achieve, it's about what we leave behind, what mark we leave on other people." They walked over to the old school bench where Caroline had once liked to sit with her friends. Joe sat down next to her, and they both sat silently for a while, lost in their own thoughts. At that moment, Caroline realized that despite her achievements and important positions, she cannot forget that the most valuable things in life are often close to us, in simple and sincere moments. Joe turned out to be the very guide who helped her remember the simple joys of life, about those people who were always there, supporting her at every step. "You're right, Joe," she said, looking back at the school. "This school isn't just walls, it's where our lives begin, and every person, even the most inconspicuous, plays a role in this life." "And it always will," Joe replied, smiling again. "We all leave a mark, even when we think we're invisible." Night had fallen completely on the schoolyard, and the silence in the air was growing deeper. Only a few stars in the sky reminded us that somewhere in the vast cosmos there was life beyond this small, familiar school building. Caroline and Joe remained sitting on the old bench. Still lost in memories and conversation, the sky was gradually darkening, and with each passing minute this moment seemed more important, as if something special was happening here, in this school. "You know, Joe, I haven't felt so alive in a long time," Caroline said, suddenly realizing that all these years of being consumed by her career and public activities had left her with something important. It was as if her life had become a series of achievements and goals and reports, but not real, sincere moments. All these years, I felt like I was doing important work, being White House secretary, working at the highest level. It meant a lot, but I always thought that was what defined my success. I forgot that it's not just what you achieve, but how you feel while you're doing it." Joe was silent, but there was a deep wisdom in his eyes. He listened attentively to her words, as always, as if giving Caroline time to sort out her own thoughts. He was an intelligent man, but not burdened with the life-affirming optimism of great achievement. His wisdom was in simplicity and in the fact that he saw in life what was hidden to most. "You're right, Caroline," he said finally, his voice calm but strong. "Sometimes we get so caught up in the pursuit of success that we don't notice how we lose ourselves. We follow the path that is shown to us, forgetting that in this world it's not just what you do that matters, but how you live, how you feel. We're used to defining success by achievements, but the real value in life is what we give to the world and to those around us, not how much money we make or how many titles we have on our wall. Caroline thought about it, her eyes filled with memories of her days as a student at this school. She remembered running around the yard, dreaming of great things and successes, but all these dreams seemed so simple and natural when she was a child. When she came back here, she felt like this path from childhood to career was like a labyrinth that she had walked through, not realizing that in fact the most important moment was right in front of her. All these years I thought I was doing something important. I was in an important position, in the White House, meeting great people, signing important documents, solving global issues. She paused for a moment, and her gaze became dreamy. But now, here, with you, I understand that none of this matters if I don't feel inner peace and harmony. I thought I had achieved everything, but something inside me always remained empty. Joe nodded slowly. He had always known that it wasn't the outer success that mattered. He hadn't had any great achievements in his life, but his heart was filled with an understanding of what really mattered. He knew how easy it was to get lost in the desire for power and recognition, and at some point, Caroline, despite all her high positions, had found herself searching for something more, too. I remember you being so determined when you were here, Joe said. You always wanted to be the best. It showed, but you, like all of us, didn't always notice the importance of what was around you, all those people, all those moments. You know they're still there, even if you've moved far away from here. Caroline looked at him, and suddenly realized how much she had missed during her years of success. These moments that she had once considered unimportant were now the building blocks on which everything else was built. All those conversations, all those moments of simple joy and ordinariness that she had missed out on while chasing ambition. Maybe I lost myself in this big world, she said, looking at the old school, and all these years I thought I could only be important through my achievements. I thought success came with recognition and power, but maybe I was wrong. Joe looked at her with a soft smile. Sometimes we need to go back and realize that what matters most is not what we've accomplished, but what we've lived through. You didn't just work in the White House, Caroline. You learned to listen, you learned to work with people, you learned to value the importance of trust and understanding. You brought those lessons with you, and they made you who you are. Her eyes filled with tears. She couldn't hold back her emotions any longer. All these years she had been pushing away her feelings, hung with awards and achievements, but at that moment she felt herself becoming herself again, the girl who once sat at her school desk, dreaming of the future, not realizing that the present was right here. You're right, Joe, she said quietly. I've learned a lot, and I realize that it's important for me to go back and feel like the person I was before all these titles and responsibilities. In this school, I learned that the importance of life is not only in what you do, but in how you feel and how you share it with others. That moment was a turning point for Caroline. She began to realize that not everything she had accomplished was important in terms of her inner happiness. What was important was how she approached life, how she interacted with others, and how she perceived herself. Right now, in this place, she felt it was time to start a new path. They sat in silence as the night engulfed the schoolyard, but Caroline no longer felt lost. She felt like she had taken a step toward a new, more conscious life, and that path began here, with memories, with conversations, with the understanding that it was not about achieving everything, but about being present and alive in each moment. Morning came quickly, but with its arrival the atmosphere around became significantly different. The sun's rays penetrated through the old windows of the school, illuminating its corridors and giving everything around it a new, fresh look. Caroline stood at the window and looked at the familiar old buildings. The school that was once so close to her now seemed almost alien, despite the memories. But the strange feeling of inner harmony that she felt the night before did not leave her. Joe was already there, waiting for her at the entrance to the school. There was no such easy smile on his face as he had greeted her yesterday. Now he looked a little more serious, as if he knew that Caroline was about to take an important step for him. Perhaps it was a routine matter, but for Caroline, it was a difficult test. It would not be easy to follow this path that she had chosen yesterday. But the inner impulse that she felt did not allow her to stop. "Good morning, Joe," she said, coming up to him. "How are you feeling today?" "Good morning, Caroline. I'm fine," he replied, smiling slightly. "Are you ready for the next step?" Caroline sighed and nodded. It was a moment of truth. She felt that it was time to make her choice, to return to herself, to her roots, to the values she had lost. She realized that life should not be a race for titles and recognition, and if she wanted to be truly happy, she needed to do something important for herself. "I'm ready," she replied, gathering her strength. They walked across the schoolyard, and Caroline felt each step bring her closer to a solution. At that moment, she remembered the old tree under which she had once sat with her friends, discussing dreams and plans for the future. The tree was still there, despite the years that had passed since then. She walked up to it and touched its bark. She could feel how it connected to her youth, to the ideals that had seemed important to her when she was still a teenager. "That tree is still here," Caroline said to Joe. "I've always loved it. It reminds me of the importance of staying rooted in what really matters." Joe came up next to me, his gaze calm but penetrating. "Yes, it, like you, has gone through many trials, but it still stands strong. You can do the same. Go through your trials and remain who you are." Caroline felt his words penetrate her soul. She knew that if she wanted to be happy, if she wanted to find inner harmony, she had to leave all external tension behind her. The path to success she had chosen for herself was not her true path. It was the path that life had forced upon her. Now she had to return to herself. "You're right, Joe." She stood under the tree, as if waiting for something important to happen. "I always thought that the higher I climbed, the happier I would be. But now I understand that it's not necessary to climb to the top. Sometimes it's important to just be with those who support you and appreciate every moment." In that moment, she felt something new opening up before her. This school, these walls, these old friends, everything seemed familiar, but now Caroline's perspective was different. She began to look at the world not through the prism of ambition, but through the prism of what truly brings joy and happiness. There was no room in her life for meaningless success if it did not bring inner satisfaction. "Caroline, you know what you need to do to move on," Joe said, looking at her with understanding. "Your path has been difficult and thorny, but now you can choose what to do next. You can go back home to your old job, or you can take a step toward something that brings you joy. You can be an example to others, showing them the importance of staying true to yourself." Caroline stood under the tree, hugged its trunk and closed her eyes. Memories started to pop up in her head again. She remembered how, as a child, she always thought she had to be the best at everything, how she wanted to be a leader, first, important, but now she realized that being first is not always what is needed. Sometimes being yourself and staying true to your values is more important than any victories and titles. She opened her eyes and looked at Joe. "I've made a decision," she said, her voice firm and confident. "I want to get back to what really matters. I want to work with people who value sincerity, honesty, and care. I'm not going to chase recognition I don't need anymore. I'm going to work where I feel at peace." Joe smiled, his eyes filling with joy. He knew this moment was important to her. He knew Caroline had found her path, and even though it was a path completely different from what she had ever expected, it was her own. "I'm proud of you, Caroline," Joe said. "You made the right decision. It may not be as flashy as the White House, but it will bring you real happiness." She nodded and felt a wave of relief run through her body. In that moment, she realized that with every minute, with every step, she was becoming more real. She was not looking for external recognition. She was looking for inner peace and harmony. They walked further across the schoolyard, and although there were many unknown roads ahead, Caroline felt that she was ready to meet them. Now, thanks to Joe and her own reflections, she knew that it was not the height that mattered to her, but the direction, and she had already chosen her path.